So it's really going to be slowing things down. Okay. But the other thing, which we're seeing here, is lack of dependency injection, right? So we've got an application scoped object, which we need to reference, and we're either creating it using the new constructor, or we're grabbing it every single time using the expression language, right? So that's really where dependency injection is very handy. So if you have a singleton or a scoped object, do not use the new operator. You should basically just use dependency injection and then basically inject that into your backing bean, right? So what you should end up with is something a little bit more like this. So we have the user provider, and we inject the user provider into this variable, this field, and then we can just work with it directly, right? So now we've avoided the extra lookup, we've avoided creating it repeatedly, okay? And now we basically just use dependency injection as well. Whoops. Okay. Okay. I do want to say, actually, I have a question. How many of you use Spring for dependency injection with JSF? Okay, so a lot of you. All right. How many of you use JSF managed beans all by themselves? So, a few of you. How many of you use context and dependency injection in Java? CDI? Okay, so a few more of you. Okay, good. So one of the things to keep in mind with dependency injection is sort of how they work, right? So managed beans, which I actually don't dislike, but they're very limited in terms of how they work. So, so for instance, in this case, it's fine, right? We're injecting user provider. User provider is a singleton. It's only created once, so this worked fine. In some cases, though, you may be injecting something that needs to change, or it's in a different scope. And that's where managed beans kind of break down a bit. So for instance, in a managed bean, if you have a managed bean that's in view scope, you cannot reference a managed bean that's in request scope because it's in a shorter scope. Those problems go away if you use Spring or CDI. Okay, so if you're using the pure managed beans, you're starting to run into limitations, consider using CDI or Spring, because they're much more powerful. They put proxies in front of the objects that can basically retrieve the right version, put transactions around them, things like that. Okay. Now, the benefit of managed beans is that they're fast and simple. So, and I would say in the future, we're definitely going to be getting rid of the JSF managed beans and using sort of the overall Java EE version of managed beans eventually. So just keep that in mind. Okay. So, does anyone see anything wrong with this? All right, eventually you two are going to have to, someone else is going to have to raise their hand. But go ahead.
I think that each pages, you just make one pages with rows, for example, instead of 3 pages.
Okay, so you're saying you could probably just have 1 page instead of 3 in this example. Okay, anyone else? Ah, that's it. So this is what I call inconsistent artifact names, right? So this happens in situations where a project starts and no one comes up with a naming convention, and the developers don't care about naming conventions. So you end up with lots of different ways to name things, different patterns, etc. So here we've got underscore, here we've got camel case, here we have sentence case, So this gets really ugly in larger applications. If you have a small application with like 5 pages, who really cares? If you have hundreds or thousands of pages, this gets really ugly fast, okay? So of course, the answer is to define and enforce naming conventions, okay? So, if you can, make sure there's something written on a wiki somewhere, and then have somebody whose job it is to bother people. Maybe it's the architect, Maybe it's the manager, maybe it's, you, if you're not one of those people, okay? Okay, so another one is initializing backing beans in the constructor, okay? Can anyone think of something that's wrong with that? Normally a constructor is for initializing things, right? So what's wrong with doing that inside the backing bean? Anybody else? All right, yes.
You're trying to relate the component with data coming from the service. The service will not be accessible in the construction.
Okay, so you're saying if you're trying to populate the backing bean with data coming from a service, the service won't be accessible in the constructor. That is basically it. So when the constructor is called, whatever properties have not been initialized yet, right? Especially with JSF injection. Basically, JSF injection always calls a no-wire constructor and then calls setters on the backing beans, right? So essentially, in the constructor, any of the properties are not going to be set, right? Now, if you use other sorts of injection, you have a little more control over things, right? But the general rule of thumb is that if you should wait until after the bean has been instantiated and then probably initialized before you bother going ahead and doing any sort of initialization, okay? So the way to do this, there's two ways actually. One is to use lazy initialization. This works in some cases. So maybe what you do is, you don't initialize anything up front and then inside of a getter or an action method, if it hasn't been initialized, you do the initialization. So there's one sort of small upfront cost, but it's happening when the user interacts with the page as opposed to upfront, okay? So they get the page faster, but maybe they do something and it takes slightly longer, okay? The key there, though, is that you only want to do it once. So do the check at the beginning of the method to say, okay, have I already initialized this object, and then initialize it, as opposed to doing it every single time, okay? So that works very well in a lot of cases. However, I find developers often like to initialize stuff up front. I think a lot of people find it easier to work with. It's easier for them to understand sort of what's happening, where all the data is coming from. So if you really do need to initialize everything once up front, do it in a method that uses the post-construct annotation, okay? And this will work in Spring or JSF, managed beans, or even with CDI, okay? So if you use a post-construct annotation, what happens is after the bean has been created and initialized, that's when all the properties, that's when the method will be called, okay? Another thing which you can do is initialize the data before the view is displayed. So the post-construct is only going to happen once, right? So if you need to do some work before the view is displayed, that's when you can use a couple other strategies. So in JSF 1.2, you can use a phase listener. And you actually can do have a phase listener which is associated with a particular view. Okay, so here this is actually a method on a backing bean. So I don't know how many people. Has anyone ever used this before? Phase listener on the F view. Okay, so I don't see it used too often, but it's pretty handy. So here we're actually calling a method on the backing bean, and we can basically you have to check to see what phase it's in, whether it's in restore view or whatever phase, and then from there you can then do whatever initialization you have to do. Okay, so that's a pretty handy way to do things. Another thing you can do in JSF2, which is a little bit easier, is you can actually use the before render event. Okay, so JSF2 has events for particular components. And this is one particular component system event called before render. And here you can basically call this method before if you put the F event for the view, at the view level, it'll be before the entire page is rendered. Okay. You can also put it on any other component if you have a particular need to initialize something, let's say before data table is displayed or something. But the most common use case is just for the entire view. Okay. So these are some ways to initialize things. All right, so another one is eager view initialization. Okay, And this is very similar to, well, not similar, but it's related to the idea of doing all of the initialization up front, okay? So as I said before, sometimes it's easier to do that, right? Because it's easier to understand sort of what's going on and everything, right? The drawback, of course, is that it's also expensive. So let's say there's a lot of data you need for the page, and you do it, let's say, using one of these methods, using before render or something, okay? And in order to make sure all the data is available, you do 4 or 5 queries, right? Maybe you call a service that does it, maybe you do them directly, who knows? So you do those 4 or 5 queries, so every time the user requests the page, they're going to those 4 or 5 queries are going to be called. Now, of course, there's things you can do. You can check to see if it's a postback, so maybe you don't do the query again. So if there's a method called is postback on the Faces context you can use. But at the bottom line is there's several queries going on, and maybe the user doesn't need you to run all 5 queries at first. Maybe 3 of those queries are really for tabs which the user only looks at 20% of the time, right? In that scenario, you don't want to do all those queries up front. You want to basically do them later, and basically that's when you can essentially use the lazy initialization sort of policy, right? So maybe you do that lookup when they click on a tab, okay? Or maybe you do it when they click on a particular button or something like that, okay? So essentially what you're trying to do is basically, number one, ensure that the user gets the page as fast as possible, right? And they're basically spreading out all the expensive operations across the usage of the page to sort of optimize the user experience, okay? Another thing is that if you let's say you do all those queries up front, you're holding on to data the user may never use. That's excess RAM, right? So if your backing bean is in view scope, you know, that's RAM the user's going to be using up. And as I said before, it's going to stick around for a while because JSF will keep a few views per user, right? So just keep that in mind. You don't want to really do a whole lot up front unless you really have to, okay? All right, so this is sort of the opposite of that problem to some degree. So if you have some libraries, some services, some data access objects, et cetera, that you have to access that are expensive and only need to be done once, then you don't want to do them inside of a backing bean and a method or something, right? If that's the case, then what you really want to do is you want to access them maybe when the application starts up, okay? So how many people have heard that a phrase sort of like warming up the application, or, you know, exercising the application or something, which you're supposed to do before anyone else uses it? You know, has anyone heard that before, right? Now sometimes that's because it's JSP and you have to compile the JSPs, right? Which you could have pre-compiled them during the build process, you wouldn't have that problem, but that's a different story. Now in Faceless you don't have that problem. There is a small compile period, but it's not like JSP, right? So often what happens is there's data which has to be loaded or something, and the first user gets all that data, right? Well, that's probably an issue, right? If someone has to use your application before it's usable by other people, then it's probably an area that can be improved upon. And sometimes the issue there is that you're loading libraries or services sort of lazily throughout the application that really could be loaded just once at startup, okay? So in that scenario, of course, the first user gets the speed slowdown, right? And basically what you can do is just initialize the objects at startup, and there's a few different ways you can do this. One is you can you know, use the Spring context loader. In JSF 1.x, you could use the servlet context listener, which gets loaded, has methods that get executed when the servlet context gets created, okay? In JSF 2, any managed bean can have a post construct, or any managed bean can have an eager attribute, okay? The eager attribute says load this at startup, okay? So what you could do is you could have an application scoped managed bean that's eager, that does whatever sort of expensive initialization up front in the post construct method. Okay? So essentially that'll get instantiated as startup, the method will get called at startup, and then you can do whatever sort of expensive connections you have to do. Okay? And you could also do something similar in CDI. You didn't get to put the actual thing there. But essentially, as long as your bean gets created as startup, then you can ensure that you initialize your expensive resources. Okay? Any questions so far? Okay. Okay. So, one problem which I've seen before is static variables in scoped objects. Okay? So, scoped object, of course, is usually in view scope, request scope, session scope, etc. Okay? And what that means is that that object only lives for a certain period of time, right? So, request scope is only going to be around for a while, session scope, etc. Static variables, however, are going to be around forever, right? For the lifetime of the class, which is essentially the lifetime of the JVM. Now, of course, it's okay to have like a static constant. That's not what I'm talking about here. So if you have constants, that's not the issue. The problem, though, is if you have variables which have state, okay? So let's say you're keeping track of some number, you're keeping some actual data, but you have it as a static variable inside of a backing bean, okay? Has anyone ever seen this before? Just curious. All right, so a couple of you have, all right. So basically, this sort of breaks the semantics of scope state, right? Because now you have a variable which has, maybe it's a tab number, maybe it's an index, who knows? But it's a stateful variable, and it's in a class which has a scope, has a defined lifespan, right? But that variable's lifespan is greater than that of the scope, okay? So it sort of breaks the whole semantics of a scoped variable. And also it can cause synchronization problems, right? So basically, one of the benefits of the JSF programming model is that any given backing bean doesn't have to worry about synchronization, right? The backing bean is usually being executed by a single thread, single user. Maybe it's being executed by multiple users or multiple threads, but it's basically associated with a single user, okay? So usually you don't have to worry about synchronizing stuff inside of a backing bean. Now, if you start putting static variables in there, that benefit goes away. Okay. The other thing is that this totally breaks in a clustered environment, right? So that contract of a scoped object is gone in a clustered environment if you have a static variable with state. So in one VM, the value of a static variable is going to be different than it is in another VM, and there's not going to be a way to correlate the two. Okay. So it's another thing to keep in mind. And I've actually seen this happen before, where we had some application, we didn't realize it had a static variable in a backing bean, and we clustered it, and all of a sudden everything started breaking, right? So the static variables do not work across VMs. So the solution to this is to use an application scoped object or a constant, right? So if you have some sort of state which you need to live for a long time, which would be the reason you would want to have a static variable. The idea is that it will be around for a long time, right? Make it application scoped, okay? Or maybe it belongs in a different scope. But basically use some sort of scoping or utility class or something like that as opposed to making a static variable in a scoped object, okay? All right. Next one is non-serializable session scoped objects, okay? So, one of the things to keep in mind is that anytime you have any sort of scoped JSF object, like a view or a session scoped object or a conversation scoped if you're using CDI or Spring, those are essentially ways to divide up the session, right? View scoped is just basically a specialized way to use a session. Same thing with conversation scope, okay? And that means that session scoped objects in general have to be serialized. So if it's in view scope or conversation scope is going to have to be serialized as well. Okay, and basically what happens if you don't do this is, you may not think about it, you write your application, then all of a sudden, it's finished, it seems to work, and then, someone says, all right, this is great, now let's cluster it, right? Let's create a cluster, let's have 5 clusters, or 5 servers, and put it in a cluster. All of a sudden your app breaks because you didn't make any of the beans serializable, okay? Because the idea is that if it's serializable, then it can be saved in the session and then moved to another server, okay? So keep that in mind. All right, so make all session view and conversation scoped objects serializable. All right, so another one which I've seen is the overcomplicated expression problem. Okay, so this is the scenario, and I don't have an example unfortunately, but I'm sure you can picture it in your head, where you have an expression in a JSF page, in a facelet page, or a JSP, and essentially it's really complicated, right? There's a whole bunch if then else state in there. It's like 2 lines in your facelet page, and essentially it's kind of ugly to look at. Okay, and you want to avoid doing this a lot. Okay, and there's a few reasons you want to do that. Number one is that they're hard to read, right? So expression language is really great for simple expressions. Okay. But if you find that it's like 2 lines, it's probably too long, okay? And so it's hard to read. And usually, if it's that long, you're basically mixing business logic with display logic, okay? So that's generally the problem, is that at some point you need to sort of make a distinction, because the actual XHTML has a purpose and the backend bean has a purpose. And if they're doing the same thing, then the purpose is kind of blurry. Okay, so try and make sure your view, your actual facelet page, focuses on displaying stuff and doesn't have expressions that are doing business logic. Okay. So of course, the easy solution to this is to move your logic into the backing bean. Okay. The other thing I should mention is that while the expression language has really been improved in terms of speed, it's probably not as fast as just calling a method. Okay, so keep that in mind. So I'm sorry. Next slide. Okay, so that's basically the solution. Just move it into a property, and then it's normally a little bit easier to read, and especially if it's business logic. Maybe it doesn't even belong in a backing bean. Maybe it belongs in a service or something. Okay. Okay. So does anyone see anything wrong with this one? Yes.
The user won't get any feedback if there is a problem getting users.
Okay. So he says the user won't get any feedback while there's a problem getting users, and that pretty much is the problem. This is what I call the exception eating anti-pattern. This is probably my number 1, number 2 pet peeve. Okay. So he's right. The user won't have any idea. So what will happen is the user will do something, and probably in this example, let's say this is going to display all the users in the system or something. The user will just see an empty grid. Which really isn't very helpful, right? The user sees an empty grid. Nobody knows what's wrong. People spend hours and they're like, oh, there's an exception. There's a stack trace in the log somewhere, right? So that's number 1 problem, right? Number 2 is that this is not really where to handle this exception. The backing bean probably doesn't know what to do in this case. Maybe it knows that it should create a message for the user. All right, so that's one option. Maybe the way to handle this is the backing bean should catch the exception, and then it should create a faces message that says, sorry, database is down or something. Okay, that may be an option. Probably not the best solution in this scenario, but it is an option. Another problem here is that there's no logging framework, right? Not using log4j, not using commons logging, JDK logging, whatever logging framework you want, right? And you can say that's not a problem, but logging is very important, and it's very important that throughout your application you try and use the same sort of logging patterns, okay? Because just printing out the stack trace doesn't really tell me much about what's going on, okay? Like, it doesn't tell me exactly really why there's a problem here, okay? So the general rule, if you cannot properly handle the exception, don't. Okay? So this is actually one of the things I've come to sort of dislike about Java is checked exceptions. Okay? So this is one of the big sort of language debates, whether you should have checked exceptions or not. For example, a lot of languages don't. C# doesn't. Most of the dynamic languages don't have checked exceptions. Okay? But in Java, if you put throws on the clause, on the method declaration, then the caller has to catch it, right? And 99% of the time, they have no idea what to do with it, right? And because you don't know what to do with it, everybody does this, right? They say, well, I got to catch it. Why don't I just catch it and not print out the error, right? But when you do this, what happens is the user ends up with very, very strange scenarios that are hard to track down because no one's handling the exception. Okay? So this is the rule. If you can't handle it, don't. Okay? Now, remember that if you don't handle the exception, there are other facilities to handle it. Well, what happens if you don't handle an exception in JSF? Anybody know? All right, go ahead. Okay, so he's saying you can get the whole stack trace in your page if you're using facelets, right? Okay. Okay, so in JSF2, you can create an exception handler to handle the exception as well. Okay. Also, there is a standard error page which you can configure in any version of JSF at the web container level, which the user will see. Okay. So maybe what the user should see in the scenario that I showed here is, an error page. I mean, it is a database error. It's probably a major problem here, right? In this scenario, the user is going to keep on interacting with the page as if things are working properly, and they probably aren't. Okay. So basically, the idea is let your exceptions bubble up to the container, and the container can handle it. So in JSF, if you are in development mode, in JSF2 or in JSF 1.x with facelets, you'll get a lovely error page which tells you exactly where it happened, the full stack trace, and also lets you see what the component tree is like. Okay. At the container level, as I said before, you can configure in web.xml an error page that can be displayed. Okay. That's what will happen at the container level. The error message will be displayed, but also the container will log it for you. Okay. So you'll see it there. What happens often, a variation of this pattern is the sort of print and throw pattern. So you essentially print out the stack trace and then you throw it again. Right? That's a very common thing as well. So what happens is in your logs you see like 4 copies of the same stack trace. Right? The container already logs it. There's no reason to log it here at all. Okay? So keep that in mind. Okay, so try and use a logger instead of system.out.println. Okay, and I say this because loggers are actually handy. They can print out lots of other information. So you can configure a logger to print out even exactly what line through the exception, but usually at least a date stamp. Maybe you want a module name. Who knows? But date stamp, other information. You can print out what thread it is. All sorts of stuff you can print out. And system.out.println is really just not that helpful. Okay. Also, if the logger may often end up in the same logs as the server logs, which may be a good thing. With the logger, you can actually create different log files. Okay, you can have different logging levels, so you can say, okay, well, I want to print out some things for all the time at info level, some things are for tracing, some things are major errors like this. Okay, like a real stack trace. Okay. Another thing you can do with a logger is you can actually have different appenders. An appender normally is the code that outputs the actual logging message, right? You can have an appender that sends an email, or an SMS message, or something else. So if there's a real error, you can notify someone right up front, as opposed to being called by an angry user who then has to track down a sysadmin, who then looks at a log and finds a random stack trace. Okay? So there's lots of benefits for actually using a logging framework of some sort, and every app server has one in the class path. They're all easy, it's easy to find one, use Apache Commons logging or something like that. Okay, so I highly recommend using a logging framework. If there's situations where you want more control over what happens, in JSF 2, you can write an exception handler. Okay, so there's an exception handler class, and it actually gets notified of all the exceptions that happen in JSF. Okay, so no matter what happens, you can catch the exception there and do whatever sort of special logging or whatever sort of stuff you want to do. Maybe you redirect them to your own error page, who knows what it is. Okay? So I would say that if you really want control over what happens, write I think it's actually an exception handler in JSF2. Write one of those and then have everything handled there. Then you have a lot of control over the behavior, but you still allow the developers to just throw the exception. Okay? All right? So the bottom line here is that if you have a backing bean method and you have an exception and you're not able to recover from it, okay, throw it and let the container handle it. Okay? So that's the bottom line. Now if it's something you can recover from, then maybe it's okay to just print out the exception or write it to a log file and then tell the user if necessary and then continue. Okay? So there are situations where it makes sense. So maybe the exception is like, no record found exception. Well, that's a recoverable exception, right? You can just tell the user there's no information found and continue. I'm here talking more about fatal, system problems or things that affect the behavior of the application. So the key there is just to make sure that you can actually control the outcome for the user. Okay? All right, I'm actually doing a whole session on exception handling at the Confess conference in like a month or so. So it's a big pet peeve of mine. So, okay. All right, so I think we're about halfway through. I think it's probably okay to take like a 5-minute break or something. I don't know if there's any refreshments, but let's take a break for a few minutes. So amazingly, I still have more anti-patterns to go through, so this is good. All right, so the next anti-pattern is unnecessary UI component bindings. Okay? So, as I said before, in JSF you can either bind to the value or you can bind the component to your backing bean, right? And usually we recommend that you bind to the value as opposed to working directly with the component, okay? Although there are some situations where you actually do need a reference to the component, it's better to limit those references as much as you can, okay? And one of the best reasons for this is that component bindings can be problematic for non-request scoped beans, okay? So if you have a component binding, several component bindings on, for example, a session scoped bean, you may have some issues, okay? The best reference for this is this URL here, which is written by, forgot his last name, this guy Blake who works for Oracle on the Oracle ADF Faces team. It's a really good sort of overview of the issues that happen with component bindings on session scoped beans. Okay, on view scoped beans, it's much more logical. Okay. But basically, there are some sort of nuances to keep in mind if your bean lives longer than request scoped. Request scoped bean, there's no problem at all. Okay. The other thing, though, is if you don't need the reference, then you probably shouldn't bother doing it because it takes up extra you know, time and everything to create that binding. Okay. There is also an issue with component bindings in view-scoped backing beans. Has anyone run into this before? Okay, so a couple of you had. So, you know, view scope is probably one of the best things in JSF2, right? So for any backing bean, which is, or any sort of page, which is an AJAX page, view scope makes perfect sense. You want your backing bean to be there for the lifetime of that page, and after they go to another page, you don't care about the backing bean anymore, right? However, component bindings break in view scope backing beans in JSF2. And if you actually look at the issue tracker for the JSF spec or Mohar, the implementation, you will find this bug listed. You know, every time I talk about it, I keep on meaning to find out if we're fixing this in JSF 2.1. I hope we are, I'm not sure. So what happens, it's sort of some weird chicken and egg problem, but the bottom line is that if you have a backing bean with a component binding and it's a view scope backing bean, partial state saving, it doesn't work with partial state saving. It sort of automatically becomes a request scoped backing bean. Unless you turn off partial state saving, then it'll actually be a view scoped backing bean. Okay? So this is a known bug in JSF2. There's no real workaround, except, actually, there is a workaround, actually, which I'll explain in a minute. Okay? Good, more people are coming back. That's good. Good sign there. Break time is always a good chance to leave if you are bored with the content. So. All right, so, but the idea is that you want to try to avoid component bindings unless you really, really need them, okay? So of course the easiest way to avoid them is to use value bindings instead. Just bind to a backing bean property and everything will work fine. You don't have to reference the component directly at all, okay? And some people really like to do this. Some people like to not have any references to components at all in their backing bean. Now their backing bean really just be more of a plain POJO. And that's fine as well. Okay, depends on what you're trying to accomplish. You can also use fset property action listener. So often people want to have a component binding because they want to be able to set some property directly somewhere. You can do so with fset property action listener. Of course, you can retrieve a component from an event object or event listeners. So, you know, you can usually only get the component that sent the event, but at least you don't need a binding in order to do so. Okay. And this is the workaround that I mentioned. So I don't think this is an official pattern, but you can use the request scoped holder pattern. Okay. So let's say you have a view scoped bean, and you really, really do need a reference to the actual component object. Okay. And I just told you that view scoped beans don't work with component bindings in JSF2. Okay. Unless you turn off partial state saving. And partial state saving is a very, very important feature in JSF2 for performance. So I really don't like to turn it off. As a matter of fact, I had a client where actually I took out the component binding so we could turn it back on. So partial state saving is a good thing to have. So what you can do is you can basically create a request scoped bean that has the references to the components. Okay. And then inject that request scoped bean into your view scoped bean. Okay? So you can always inject a bean with a shorter lifespan in managed beans, or if you're using Spring or something, it doesn't even matter, right? So inject that request scoped bean into your view scoped bean. The request scoped bean has the references, the component bindings, okay? And then the view scoped bean just gets to the component through the request scoped bean, okay? So, and that works because there's no problems with request scoped beans and component bindings, okay? And that pattern also works if you have a session scoped bean for some reason as well that needs to reference components, okay? So again, if you really need to have a component binding and you have a view scoped or a session scoped bean, you can use this request scoped holder pattern, okay? So keep that in mind. All right, so here's another one, which is, I don't have an example for this, but it's called backing bean messages, okay? So this is what happens when you want to display a message to the user, and in order to do so, you have a property in your backing bean which has the message. So maybe the property is like, you know, outcome message or something. Okay. So that's a property. You know, if someone executes an action, you set the value of that property to be like, you know, your operation was completed successfully, and then you display that property. Okay. So that's what I call backing bean messages. And this is an anti-pattern because there's a very simple built-in way to display messages in JSF, right? It's called the faces message, right? So you should use the ordinary JSF messages if you can, okay? Because usually that's how you display messages. So if you start displaying random informational messages through backing bean properties, it's very sort of non-standard in terms of the normal way you use JSF, okay? So new developers will get a little bit confused by that. Also, since JSF has a message mechanism, usually there's not a good reason to do this. Okay. In general, if you are creating faces messages, you can always create convenience methods in your base backing bean class for creating messages if you want. If you want to make that process easier, or if you want to standardize the process of creating the messages, you can do things that way. Okay. Now, sometimes there are issues with scope, so you want to just make sure that your messages are displayed, you know, properly. Let's say if you go to another page or a redirect or something, and in JSF 2 they generally will be. Okay. In JSF 1.x it's a little messier. Sometimes you may lose messages when you don't want to. Okay, and that's when you might have to do some sort of things like use an add-on or resort to the backing bean message anti-pattern. In JSF 2, there's really no excuse because the faces messages are usually carried properly through redirects and things like that. Okay, as long as you use the proper JSF redirect features. Okay. Okay, so another anti-pattern is immediate overuse. Okay. So this is basically where you have, you know, a page, let's say you're using Ajax or something, and you're using the immediate attribute on different input controls, okay? So the immediate attribute is sort of a special feature in JSF that basically says that for any given component to apply the, basically the update model phase and the different phases before everything else. Okay, and also invoke application, etc., before sort of the normal validation and conversion occurs. Okay, so the most common use case for immediate is sort of a cancel button or something. So you know, if you have a cancel button and you're submitting a form, you want the action for the button to be executed first before the whole page is submitted, like because you don't really want to process the whole page, right? So that's the most common use case. But sometimes I've seen people use it on different input controls as well. Okay. And basically what happens if you do that is things get very complicated because when you look at the page you have to understand exactly when properties are being updated and sort of what's happening with the life cycle. Okay? So for example, let's say you have an input control. Let's say you have two input controls. One has immediate set to true and one doesn't. Okay? And you submit a form. What's going to happen is the one with immediate to true, its value is going to be updated and everything before conversion and validation happens for the second control. Okay, and sometimes that's what you want because maybe there's some behavior you want to occur sort of in between there, but often it's not. So basically, the idea is to try and avoid using it for non-command components. Okay. One of the things you can do is put input controls in a separate form. Sometimes people use immediate because what they want is for all the values to be submitted separately for some fields and other fields. So if you put it in separate form, you can achieve that behavior. Okay. Also, you can use Ajax features instead. Okay. So maybe what you're trying to achieve is basically sending that particular value so you can process it separately. Okay. So what you can do is if you use AJAX is that you can basically send only the values that you want to process as opposed to trying to have it executed at a different part in the JSF lifecycle. Okay? So that helps as well. Has anyone ever seen this before? Has anyone ever used immediate for an input control? Okay, so a couple of you have. Okay. And there are some situations where it's legitimate, but I've seen it overused. Okay. So these are some ways you can avoid doing that. Yes?
The problem with having the constructor in separate forms is that for each form you can have a JavaX view state variable inside each one. And if you have a lot of forms in the page, it can become quite big, quite cumbersome. So
That's true. Yeah, you wouldn't want to do it for lots and lots of them.
the problem is the view state weighted more than 2 megabytes for each page because there's 4 forms inside a very big one.
Huh.
You want to change it. That's why on some control we put them on immediate rather than put in separate forms.
I see. So basically, if you couldn't hear him, what he's saying is that because of the view state element, which is associated with each form, they use the immediate attribute because they didn't want to have too many forms because it increases the size of the page by a lot. So that may be a legitimate use case for it. Okay. I think the scenario where I saw it, it was basically being used for a lot of conditional stuff, which there were better ways to handle it, but basically by using some of the features. Okay. Any other questions?